speaking about business this hour, and speaking about money, and speaking about debt, and where are we in terms of numbers. Like I said, our guests for this hour are seated in the studio. Billow Kerrow is no guest, rather no stranger to the Situation Room. Billow Kerrow is former chair of Senate Finance and Budget Committee, and he's joined by Dr. Patrick Muinde this morning, who is a economic and financial expert. Gentlemen, good morning to you and happy Monday.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Karibu sana.
Sandy.
Okay, like I said, it's a hot one because there's a lot going on in the country today. Debt through the roof, expectations of payment of that debt in less than a year, rising taxes, the expectation on the shoulders of Kenyans today. So we're going to go through it and see, well, so where are we and what needs to happen. But before we get into that, CT has a proverb from a country somewhere in East Africa to welcome you.
It's a country I think the two of you gentlemen will be familiar with. Have you heard of a country called Kenya?
There's one we know at least.
It may be changing every day, but you know.
There's one we know.
There's one, maybe there's a country called Kenya which you knew, and there's one which you know, but then may not necessarily be the same country.
Yeah. Yes.
Yes,
I think around this time, so I'm not be sure which country we're talking about.
The Kenya we know is changing.
Isn't it just? Yes. Okay. Stealing the village drum may be easy, but finding a place to beat it peacefully is the problem.
Billow?
Yeah.
What does this mean to you? You're nodding in knowledge, wonderment.
And now, it sounds very truthful. I mean, we are all brought up in an African village setting, and we know it sounds so truthful. When you steal a drum, obviously, the drum is for beating. But so my take maybe is not correct, but what I think is that you may still the resources of the country, but you still need a country to use those resources in or something. But I think Patrick will be better.
Oh no! It's actually the beauty of interpreting a proverb is that you can't be wrong.
Yes,
it's how it resonates with you, and you put it well. I hadn't thought of what you're saying, but it's yes. You take something that isn't yours. Now the problem is, how are you going
to use it?
Yes, and I say, how will you get away with it?
Yeah,
because you have it. How will you use it without it? Because it will point, the very thing you've taken is what will point at you and say, that is the culprit. That's the person who did this.
Indeed. What about you, Doctor?
For me, it's I will also relate to part of what we have in Scripture, that what we do in secret will eventually come to haunt us or manifest somewhere. And looking at the context we are in, there's a lot of talking out there. There's a lot of projection of a very prosperous country. But eventually the data will tell us the truth. And I think we came here to talk about numbers. The numbers are going to tell us the truth. So while we can steal the drum, when we beat it, the truth will come out. And I think this is the facts we saw last week. The data is coming for the first year, and this is official data because this is the data of the control on budget. And I think there are a lot of interesting things that we need to look at there. So what we are doing in darkness is manifesting in reality.
It is similar to what the English say: you can run, but you can't hide.
Yes,
Yes,
it is.
Okay, well, let's look at some of these numbers, shall we? And then maybe we can have an idea of where we really are. 250 billion. That the government surpasses the debt ceiling by 250 billion shillings and hits the 10.25 trillion in borrowing. Okay? Park that. Development expenditure drops below 15%. Recurrent hits 85%. So that means in terms of developing, where Kenya's not developing anything, there's nothing new, there's nothing going on in terms of development. But recurrent expenditure, which then comes in terms of wages, payments, travel, things like that, is at 85%. So if you have 100%, 85% is being spent regularly, 15% is being spent in what should be developing the country. All right. Government travel expenditure to June 2023 was at 20.3 billion shillings. So from new government until June, 20.3 billion.
It's a lot of traveling, huh?
In it. The Office of the President, the Office of the Deputy President, and the Prime Cabinet Secretary lead in travel spending. Parliament has spent 9.1 billion shillings on travel and 2.9 billion on foreign travel. Let's be clear. 9.151 billion shillings on travel, which is local, which is complete. But of that 9.1, 2.9 billion is foreign travel. We can go on and on and on. But the Control of Budget also did come out, and she gave some interesting numbers as well in terms of what has or not been spent. We'll look at that in a little while. But this is what it looks like today in terms of what is owed. If we look at external that is owed as well, 2024 is coming very quickly. The 2 billion shilling Eurobond is due.
$1 billion.
Billion dollars, exactly. $2 billion Eurobond is due June 2024. So that's kind of what it looks like right now. And what we are being told is that in order to make the payments on all of these things, the surefire way of having that done is to tax people in the country a little bit more. And we'll get a few more shillings in the basket, which will allow these payments to be made from both of you, starting with you, Billow. Is that true? Can we actually make all these payments and be fine with increasing the taxes on people? And what does the state of these numbers that we have introduced so far tell of Kenya today?
If you borrow more than your capacity, even as an individual, where do you end up? You end up in a bankruptcy. You end up in your properties being being auctioned and so forth. For a government, the situation is no different. If you live beyond your means, if you live large, as we've done in this country called Kenya, and it catches up with us like now, and as they admitted themselves that they are under receivership, then the price to pay is going to be high, and that price will be paid by the taxpayers, and no one else. So this is why you see all this clamor for taxes on everything. It's about raising money every which way you can. Tax, and this, I think we haven't seen that. It's just the beginning. This is the first year of the 5-year term of this government, and once you have gone into an IMF admission list, you have been put on ICU, and then the prescriptions are going to be pretty tough, and all of it will be about cutting down on employment, on wage freeze and those things, but increasing on taxes and make the situation very difficult. However, the sad thing is that even in this difficult situation, the government continues to live large. That we are seeing 85% of the money in their first year of office being spent on recurrent expenditure, contrary to the law, the Public Finance Management Act, which requires not more than 70% to be, at least a third should go to development. So we have a situation where they tell us we are in crisis, we are in ICU, we are in a receivership, but they have not changed their way of life completely. It's still the same way. They still can spend the way you have seen. So the situation is pretty tough. And I think for me, everything about our current situation is largely because of the debt. And because of the debt, we have got our shilling that has been devalued substantially. Because of the debt, we have to raise a lot of different taxes. And because of the of the debt, then our cost of living and all these things, because of the two I've mentioned, then gets worse, and the condition, the situation of Kenyans getting worse by the day. So in my view, really, I haven't seen any significant focus by this administration on the issue of how to manage the debt.
Okay. So at this stage, what we're doing is a diagnosis, right, of what we are looking at here. For you, Patrick, what do you see with the numbers and with clarity, what we are seeing in the country today? What do you see as the situation for Kenya economically right now?
I think I want to put the numbers in context first. We walk back a bit.
Okay.
When the Kenya Kwanza administration came and when the president took office, one of the things that he was very ambitious about was taxes. You remember the discussion about 5 trillion tax in the next 5 years. What are the numbers telling us? We've looked at the expenditure side. Let's look at the revenue. The control of budget reported tax revenue was 1.96 trillion. Now, in June 2022, the last year of the Kenyatta administration, KRA collected 2.034 trillion. So the Kenya Kwanza has underperformed on tax revenue compared to the Kenyatta administration. So that's one. Put that
in the same time period, if you want
in
to
the same
compare.
time period, yes, because that was the data in June 2022.
Yes.
The controller of budget has reported 1.96 tax revenue. So we have underperformed. Okay, we have added new taxes this current year from July. Now, the first one that became effective that we can count was the VAT on petrol and petroleum products. Now, when you look at the budget review and outlook paper that's out for public participation right now, which was issued last week, go to the fiscal policy proposals and the actual revenue that was collected for August 2023. Now, KRA had targeted 410 billion. They only collected 351 billion. Now, that includes the component of the VAT on petroleum products because they came effective on July. Now, what I'm not sure is whether the August revenue data includes the housing levy, because the housing levy was collected and backdated
to July
in August. So I'm not sure whether the companies and businesses already remitted to be included in that data. So we already know now the taxes are not being productive. And this is the question we've been asking. When we say more taxes, exactly what are we saying? Now, I've kept on saying Kenya is part of a broader global economic system. There are certain rules about economics that are universal and across board to all of us. And I think there have been a clip that has been on social media, and I think most of us might have seen it, the lava curve, where you cannot grow a country through taxes. The higher you tax, the more taxes become counterproductive. Now, let me put this in numbers. In at personal level. Now, the housing levy, many of us were opposed to it. Now, the moment it became an act, you don't have a choice. So you have to pay it. Because you are a responsible citizen, it's a civic obligation to pay that tax. Because the government has declared it a tax and a levy. So I don't choose whether I'll pay it or not. But that is only one side of the equation. Now, I have control on how I spend. Okay? So while the government can impose the tax, the law, you cannot dictate how the citizens decide to consume. So if, for example, I feel that the VAT on petroleum product is expensive, I choose whether to drive or not. And the government cannot dictate that. So the fact that I cannot avoid the law does not remove my discretion on how I spend. And this is where the counterproductivity of the taxes is coming in.
Okay.
Now, we have also started seeing how businesses are making decisions. I think last week, the second largest taxpayer in the country, who is East African Breweries, declared about 168 positions redundant. And actually, they talked about expensive business operating environment. Now, as we move towards the quarter, probably by December, we are going to see more, and I project we are going to see more businesses making that decision. Because the levies that they are paying, it is either has to be compensated through their incomes, and if they are not driving their sales, what choice do they have? Now, unlike government, we've seen the government continue to be extravagant, and the government does not seem to be sensitive and alive to the operating environment in which they are in for businesses. And at the end of the day, it has to make returns where it matters most. So you can't see the numbers coming in. The businesses will have to make a decision. And that decision becomes counterproductive to the government on targets. And we have seen, I think Treasury tried to voice this last week, where they said they are not seeing changes in the revenues despite the high taxes. And for me, I think we are doing wild shots in taxation. Now the problem.
But how is that possible? And
Now,
maybe we can just insert on that and then maybe split here. How is it possible, number one, that a government says we need to collect more taxes because our debt burden is here. We need to run the country. That's also up here in terms of priority. We, however, said we are raising the taxes in order to allow us to do so. But at the same time, they're saying, but we are not realizing the fruits of this tax collection. How is that possible? How can that be?
It is. It's basic common sense. Now, the cow is not producing milk. And you continue to milk it more. And you're not feeding it. How does it produce more milk? Now, look at, like, even when you talk about the debt. Because we've been told this debt was inherited. Is that true? The data is no. The Control on Budget report, the debt as at June 2022 was 8.63 trillion. The debt as at June 2023 was 10.25 trillion. So that is a net increase of debt of more than 1.5 trillion. So in actual sense, actually we have borrowed more than the Kenyatta administration. So while we say we inherited the debt, there's no mechanisms to cut down on the debt. But let's try to understand the development expenditure, because that's where the catch is. Now, the development expenditure is supposed to be investment into the economy.
Yes.
Okay. Now, the Constitution of Kenya, which is the supreme law, dictates that 30% of the government spending must go to development. Now, the Control on Budget has reported the national government itself spent only 14.9%, okay, on development expenditure. Counties, you look at the report for the county governments, they spend 22.7% on development. Overall, national government and county government, when you compute the average spending on development, it will come to about 15.6%. So that's one side. Now, let's look at the key drivers of this cost government spending. Now, because you cannot talk about this cost in isolation. Where is the tax that we collected? The 1.96 trillion, where did it go? Number one, the priority expenditure is debt. Now, interest expense, the interest, not the principal, took 683 billion. Interest expense only. And that is the first charge. When you compute the percentage of that to 1.96, it comes to around 30, almost 36%. Now, the second priority charge of government in government spending programs is salaries and emoluments.
Yes.
Now, the national government alone, excluding NIS and military spending, salaries, they spend 542 billion. Okay, that does not include the NIS expenditure, military emoluments, because those are classified as security. And then there's the consolidated fund services. These are the salaries that are paid to the president,
Yes.
constitutional commissions, and even parliament, because they draw the money directly from the CFS. So their salaries are not part of the 542 billion. So that's only what went to the civil service and state agencies. The counties themselves, they spend 190.1 billion. Now, when you take the total of the salaries and emolument, excluding NIS, military, and consolidated fund services, we spent 732 billion on salaries and wages. Now, those are consumers.
Yes.
So in a nutshell, when you pair that against the revenue collected, the actual revenue collected, we are spending at least 72% on debt interest and salaries. When you include those consolidated fund services, military and all that expenses, assuming they spend another 80 billion on salaries, then you're talking about 76% of the revenue going to salaries and debt repayment. So what is left to do development? Now, when you look at the development component for the national government, most of the development component in national government is transfers to sagas. Okay? So the ministries have sagas. So the spending, the transfers, most of the transfer they make to the agencies under them is counted as development.
It's counted as development, but it's actually moving money from point A to point B.
Point B. And when they go to these agencies, they also have their emoluments. They are recurrent expenses. So the actual investment into the economy is negligible.
So there's a problem,
Those are the
Billow, isn't
numbers.
there? One thing we do know that if Kenya is to borrow, again, as prescribed by law, that if Kenya is to borrow, that money is to go for development, right? Kenya cannot, if you borrow money, it's for development, or in a very rare circumstance, to then make up for any budgetary deficit on cash spending. That we know. These monies that have been borrowed, from what Patrick is telling us this morning, is that number one, tax money that has come in has largely been spent on recurrent expenditure, fulfilling the wage bill. And then we also see transfers of cash and development money maybe will make up for some 26%. Because that's what would make sense, isn't it? That what is left would go towards development. However, Kenya has a debt of 10.025, and a debt means you borrow the money, isn't it? But we are seeing that the 26% does not make up for what this debt should actually go to. So where would the discrepancy come, and how would that be explained? That you owe this money to external, and we know that the only reason why you would borrow was for development. But we're not even seeing 30% of development expenditure. So where did the money go, I think, is a simple question here.
Now, I think this question we have discussed many times in the last decade or more. The numbers is simple arithmetic. Your income, you're told, is 2 trillion. Your income. Simple arithmetic. And your expenditure, the budget, the most conservative figures now adjusted is 3.9 trillion. Of course, that doesn't include the debt, principal debt payments. So 3.9 trillion is what you want to spend. And you're collecting 2 trillion.
Yeah.
You can see the difference minus anybody. Even the kids can tell you it's 1.9 trillion.
You don't have
that. That has to be borrowed. You don't have it. Now, and then you are told, and that is more than, is more than 50%. Yeah. Of more than actually, because you're collected 2 and you're collecting 1.9 is almost 50-50.
Almost 50% of the budget.
Yeah, but you've said your development is 15%. So clearly, over the last more than a decade now, we have been borrowing money to finance consumption. I mean, that's no brainer. Everyone knows that that's what has been happening. The issue of this Eurobond, for example, which is due next year, was very controversial. You remember when that $2 billion was taken, the government was under pressure to explain if this thing went to development, where? Give us the figures. Yeah. And the government to date has not been able to explain. The same thing happens to all this borrowing that they are doing. So clearly, if you ask, then the answer to your simple question is the money is being spent on consumption. And that's the reality in this country. We're just simply borrowing money for consumption. Never mind what they tell you in rallies or in parliament. That's the reality. And again, the other interesting thing is that this government cannot afford to hide certain things. When you look at the budget policy documents which were tabled early this year, clearly they showed in those budget policy statements that the government is going to borrow. For the 5 years they're going to be in power, this administration. Their own figures that they had put in the budget policy documents, 5 trillion more. But that is assuming that they will collect all the revenues which are targeted, which they are not able to, obviously. You target 2.5 trillion, you collect 2 trillion. You target 2.7, you collect 2.1. So the difference means, again, you'll still have to borrow. So the borrowing in this administration is not going to get worse. That's clear. And so unless two things happen, that one, this government wakes up to the reality that this borrowing is going to cost them their jobs. That's the only way. That's the only language. That's why this debate on cost of living was very important. On the streets, off the streets, that was the critical debate. That's the language that government does not want, because they know that ultimately it will mean cut down. on what you're doing.
So the reality of the situation is that the control of budget wants a special audit of our public debt, right? That's number one. That up until 30th June 2023, 9.5 billion shillings was borrowed. Public debt is now at 10.2 trillion, up from 8.6 trillion in June. That means in 1 year, it has risen by 1.6.
No.
Yeah.
That's, you see, Patrick knows those are the other loans.
That's only the central bank.
Those are only figures central bank published. But let me tell you, there are loans that have been committed, but have not yet been, included. When you go to a bank and sign on to something, but it has not yet started, the drawdown has not started or something.
Yes, we've not started paying back.
Two, the loans that the government guarantees for state corporations, which is huge, is normally not included in those central bank figures also.
Why?
Because those are different institutions. I mean, if you guarantee Kenyan's loan for, say, 10 billion, that guarantee, ultimately, it is going to be the government as a liability that will ultimately, and for most state corporations. So when you actually say our loan is at 10.25, that's an understatement. Our loan could be higher. By a more significant figure, it's almost another 3-4 billion because of those commitments and because of those state corporation loans that have been guaranteed and so forth. So that's why when you find, and this I think the media also is to blame. Let me tell you, the president goes to the US and says we have got 8.7 billion from somewhere to buy some electric buses. It's not a grant, it's not free money, but the way the media would put it, they will use the word support the government. It is a loans. There's nobody who's giving you free money. So every time they go out, and you hear about, the government is going to get this, the government is going to get that. These are all commitments, one way or the other, which ultimately, very rare circumstances would it be a grant, and in that case it would be whatever. So I think that's the challenge we're having. There's a lot of money being borrowed. And even when they have borrowed,
Billow, is that the problem? I don't know that. Is that the problem? A lot of money is being borrowed. It doesn't seem to be complete to me. A lot of money is being borrowed, and it is not clear what that money is being used for. That's the problem, isn't it?
Yeah. You see, even when I was in Parliament, the issue of getting government to accept an independent audit of the debt stock of this country has been a very controversial one. They won't. Never mind what the controller says. But for the government of Kenya to come and say, okay, we want PwC, we want an independent body to come and audit what our debt stock is, that has been a challenge. Even now, when we have a debt management office with senior people, very competent, who are running it, by and large, the issues of debts are always being handled by other aspects of the government, whether it's State House or Treasury or others. So this is the challenge. That is it's not just about. There are many issues of debt. For example, when this government came in, you remember the Treasury bill, which is what they borrow daily to every month to pay salaries and so forth until they collect their revenue, was around 7.8, 7.9. And you remember the president saying that I will not allow the Treasury bill rates, to go to 10. Mm-hmm. Do you know now it's 15-16%? It's just like me and you borrowing from a bank. In fact, sometimes higher than what me and you are borrowing from. 15, and this has not happened in this country. There is no time in the history of this country that a government whose debt is guaranteed, because this is one of the safest debt you can ever, in any government. They're called sovereign debts. I mean, it's guaranteed. They have preferential rights to pay any government, whether this one goes or not. You cannot have this kind of rates. So what it means is that the government, its appetite has become so much that it's now become. That's why our banks are making trillions in budget, in revenue, in profits.
Maybe I can add something.
Yes, please, because I was just going to say. I mean, just before I was just going to say that it is clear what the situation is, but then it is clear that the lack of an appetite to, number one, be very open and honest about what's going on, and then at the same time try to fix the problem, then becomes an issue. But then a lot of people say, well, let them do whatever they want to do, without realizing the effect that it has. The cost of living conversation, which you brought up, does this not bear direct impact on that? And if it does, how does it?
Maybe we need to demystify the use of credit. Now, within the economic language, credit is not bad per se. And this is what economists call financial leverage. Financial leverage simply means you're using somebody's money to create more money. Okay? So as long as you are able to use somebody's money to create more money, then there's nothing wrong with debt. So you can actually use debt 100% in that context. Now, that equilibrium collapses the moment you're not able to leverage. If you're not able to leverage, for example, if we say, like the Constitution says, because this is part of the principles of the Constitution and Article 201, that public debt is strictly for development expenditure.
Yes.
Now, go to the budget itself. Development expenditure under the budget that has just ended was planned at 715 billion. Okay? Now, there have been 2 amendments that were done, supplementary amendments. Now, the supplementary amendment reduced from 715 billion to 518 or thereabout. So the current administration actually cut down on development expenditures in the budget itself through supplementary.
With explanation?
Without explanation, because what they did, they cut down on development, but they increased the recurrent in the budget, in the supplementary. And that's why you see, like, when you read the control on budget report, there is supplement. In fact, every sentence they are saying this was the amount original budget. Supplementary 1 reduced it to this. Supplementary 2 changed it to this. So as you read the report, that is recurrent. Now, this is one thing that we're saying. At the budget stage, when Parliament is considering the budget in June, the budget appears balanced. But immediately after that, you trigger something that starts working against development expenditure in favor of recurrent.
Why?
But then,
I'm sorry, Patrick. Why would you do that? And I think it's important for us to explain this. Like the ABCs. Why would you put a budget which is very public, right, to let people know this is what we want to spend, because that's what the budget process is. This is what we want to spend, and this is how we're going to spend it. And this is where the money is going to come from. Those 3 things, very simply put, but that's exactly what it is. Yeah. Why would you then come after the fact and then say, actually, you know what? We're going to reduce on this component, which you're constitutionally bound to do, but we're going to reduce that in the supplementary budget and not give any explanation for it, and then just go ahead as though, it's raining on Monday and the sun will shine later. Why would you do that?
You see, those are direct contraventions to the Constitution. Because when you look at the order of budgeting, there's one, the economic policy, that is passed in February. We call the budget policy statement. Now, the budget policy statement sets the overall numbers for the country. Now, this is what is based on what the economists are projected, what is realistic from the country. Now, at the stage of supplementary, you are not supposed to go outside what was passed at the economic plan. So the moment the budget supplementary estimates are being done against the BPS, we're already breaching the Constitution. Now, this is one of the roles of failures of oversight, because Parliament does not go back and ask, now, we budgeted for this amount of money, why have we reduced it? There'll be part of the conveyor belt that allows these adjustments. But then let's get the numbers themselves. Now, the public debt, and I think Billow has just said that. Now, it's a very complex issue for us. Now, there's the debt portfolio that is with the central bank, and that is where those numbers have been picked. There's what we call off-balance sheet debt. These are debt that are held by state agencies. For example, I'll give a very good example. When you go to Kenya Railways accounts, the one that be audited by the Auditor General, you'll find a debt of about 350-something billion. Okay? It is carried in those books. That debt is not in Central Bank, but it is in the books of Kenya Railway. Which loan is that?
Who owes who what, Patrick?
Which loan is that is normally carried in the Kenya Railways? It is the SGR loan. So the SGR loan is not part of what we are counting here. That's exactly what it means. Now, IMF has been pushing the government to declare that loan, or those off-balance sheet loans. And the current estimate is about 3 point something. We know it's about over 3.5 trillion, but it's not part of that debt. But then let's come to understand this. We are Kenyans and we understand what is happening. Now, we know part of the budget, and I've said this clearly several times when I appeared here, you cannot get money from government if it is not in the plan and not in the budget. Okay? So if I want to steal money from the government, I have to put it in the plan. It has to be budgeted and get approved. So now let's understand this public debt. What we are borrowing for development, let's say we borrow it for development. But we know in these projects, we have padded corruption. Now, it's only in Kenya where we are spending 1.2, 1.5 billion per kilometer of road. Our neighbors are spending 200, 250 million.
About 1.5.
Yes.
Sometimes they spend 10 billion on some roads.
On road.
Per kilometer.
Yes.
Per kilometer.
And the same companies that are building roads in Kenya are the same companies that are building those roads in the region. But in those regions, the other countries are paying 250 million, 350 million. In Kenya, it's $1 billion, 5, 3, 4 times.
So the
more.
question, the answer to the question.
Let me put it another way.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Your question you asked, let me put it another way. Budget is a political instrument. Let's start from there. Budgeting is a political process. And government does these things for political, so that they can also get some, feel good thing on the budget. Our budget is big, our budget has this or that. That's the political aspect. They have to give that spin. So they have to put in, even when they have no money. And they know they don't have money, they're only getting 2 trillion. They have to prepare a budget of 4 trillion so that they can have expenditures for this and for the government, for roads, for what, so that you feel that the government is doing something.
Yes.
For the people. That's the political side of it. But I think the main question you're asking also is about accountability. The challenge we have in this country is about accountability. Governments have gotten away with all these problems that you have seen without any form of accountability or without any penalty. And yet the law is very clear that even an accounting officer in a ministry, if he or she spends above the budget or anything outside the budget, there are penalties provided for in law. But you rarely see any penalties. So what happens is that there's no accountability, and people do what they want to do, in government. This is the challenge. So, and let me tell you, for me, I always insisted that the buck really stops at the president, because unless you say no, people must be accountable for everything in government, including myself. But when you have the first institution that the controller reports has spent over the budget, is your office. Like what she reported in last quarter about the State House expenditures on travel and so forth. You are the first person, who disregards, all those budget limits. Then, the question of accountability does not arise, will not be taken anyway. So I think that is it. So it all boils down to the challenge you have in this is good leadership. It's about governance. If we don't really take governance seriously, we'll talk about these loans. We'll talk about, every day you see about people complaining that the government has spent, and this is from the Auditor General and the Controller, outside the budget, things that have not been budgeted for has been spent. And you don't see anybody being penalized. You don't see anybody being dealt with in any way in accordance with the law. And so these things continue to happen. But I think those are the issues. And I think what he says about corruption being budgeted for in this country is a reality. If you want, you can walk into Treasury, if you have connections, and have a particular road that you want to do as the contractor, to be budgeted for. And it will be budgeted for and resources allocated, and you will get that job. And it's happening. You have got some liability that has not been paid. You can, if you have connections in Treasury, get it budgeted for through the Parliament and through the Treasury, and that money will get paid to you. I mean, so we have in a situation where integrity really, it's the main problem, and that's all about governance. That's the challenge we have. So when somebody tells you, we are going to do this, frankly, you read about all these things, the situation keeps on getting worse. But for me, that the challenge now is not about the politics. It's about the reality that people are finding life to be extremely difficult, and the government is oblivious to the suffering.
But Mheshimiwa, it isn't
oblivious. That's the word I want to use.
It isn't that they're finding it extremely difficult. It's impossible, not difficult. Because if what you're saying is taken at face value, then the end of the road that we keep speaking of and saying, at what point will Kenyans get to the point where they cannot stretch anymore? There are those who argue It is amazing how Kenyans keep adjusting to this. Those of you who understand economics, there's a point where there's no elasticity.
Yes.
There's a breaking point.
Yes.
Yes, there's a point beyond which you can't forget explaining anything away. You cannot simply accommodate the situation. So, in essence, is it when, for instance, the government has set this budget for themselves with the help of their friends in the Bretton Woods institutions, when the revenue they expect from the taxes keeps dropping, because it's going to drop, it's going to continue dropping.
Yes.
Which means the very things that we say we were borrowing for and the debts that we already have, which are scheduled to be paid, will get to a point where they will not be paid because we will not be able to pay them irrespective of what we do.
Yeah.
Now, I think we need to also start putting it in a broader context, because we are seeing the indicators. For example, and I think those, if you look at my article on Saturday, I talked about the logic of government trying to export labor. See, the government has taken it as an official policy now. It's a kind of admitting we cannot create employment in the country. Let's encourage our people to go and work out there. Now, that's one of the indicators of government admitting failure indirectly. It is the sovereign duty of any government to ensure the environment is able to work for the people and create employment. Now, here we have a government that has taken an official policy that we can't help go out there. Of course, it's my right to choose where I work. So citizens on their own, they're able to choose if they choose to go and work outside the country. You can't control that. But it can never be an official policy to do that. Now, one, because you will be losing your capital, your human capital, which is one of the most critical component of development. Now, the high taxes, because we start seeing how these policies are playing together. Now, in the mind of the government, they're thinking it's hustlers who are going to go and work out there. But here we are, the ones who are in professional and who are in employment, they're now feeling a very huge tax burden. So it's not the hustlers who will leave the country. The professionals will also leave the country because they want to run out of the high tax burden. And we can look at it. Look at the health sector. We have no doctors. We have not nurses. We have no lab technicians. But Kenya is one of the highest exporters of healthcare workers to the developed nations. Go to the US, go to Australia, go to Europe.
But Daktari, if you look at this, really, is this a failure of the government to absorb the manpower? Because we're exporting what we have, which means we have that manpower. And even if we don't export all of it, is it the ability of the government to absorb them, or simply a refusal to find ways and means of absorbing them? Like you keep hearing this story of they add to the numbers of teachers. They actually don't. What they do is they replace teachers who have retired.
Of course.
Yeah. You see now, look at what is happening. Look at the higher education. We are already talking about spending billions in investing in these people to train them at the university. So you train engineers, you train doctors, you train pharmacists. But they are not on the productive side of the economy. You spend on them. Because the reason why you are putting public money on these professionals to train them
is so they can feed back.
So that they can feed back and come and produce in the economy. Now, what are they doing? You're telling them, go out there. Now, the thinking is that we are going to grow the diaspora remittances. Now, diaspora remittances cannot be a sustainable means of growing the economy. Okay, when it comes, it's good. But it cannot be what we are prioritizing. Look at the diaspora remittances now is the highest tax earner for the country. That already tells you there's a problem with the economy. Because we are supposed to be exporting agricultural product, processed product. We are supposed to be
exporting surplus,
mechanized equipment. That's what we are supposed to be doing. We're
exporting service.
But which service?
We're coming to the top of the hour, and I'd like to come back and start the top of the hour with that Billow, if we could.
This is the Situation Room, the only way to start your day.